In the fifth section of In Memoriam, Tennyson meditates on the role of poetry in grief. He says, I sometimes hold it half a sin to put in words the grief I feel, for words, like nature, half reveal and half conceal the soul within. But for the unquiet heart and brain, a use in measured language lies, the sad mechanic exercise, like dull narcotics numbing pain. In words like weeds I'll wrap me o'er, like coarsest clothes against the cold. But that large grief which these enfold is given in outline and no more. So this is a primary theme that runs throughout In Memoriam, and that is, can one find a language appropriate to the grief? Language that will express the grief while also soothing one from the excessive agony that the grief can cause. It's interesting to note that Tennyson created his own form for In Memoriam. He created what is now known as the In Memoriam stanza. So you probably noticed this, that he uses the same stanza form throughout the whole poem. It is A, B, B, A in terms of rhyme scheme, and it is iambic tetrameter. It's quite a feat for Tennyson to use the same stanza throughout a poem that is so varied. We see poems of celebration, we see poems of deep sorrow, we see poems of meditation, we see poems that are excited, we see poems that are full of languor. So for him to be able to strike this balance between repetition and difference, predictability and variation, is quite remarkable. And what his commitment to this stanza does is it shows him exactly trying to find a measure. So we can think here of poetic language as distinct from the language of prose. Poetic language is one of measure, meaning that there are set rhythms and there are set rhymes, which can suggest mathematical control almost over wild emotion. So the actual use of this stanza is an example of what the poet is searching for, and ultimately a testament to the fact that the utterance of grief in poetry is ultimately the most successful way, perhaps, to both express the grief, because grief, as he's suggesting here, can never be revealed fully by language. But what does poetic language offer that non-poetic language doesn't? The musicality. And again, we're getting to issues of rhythm and meter. The musicality can express parts of grief that go beyond mere semantics. I can describe grief to you as best I can using my words that have meanings you can look up in the dictionary. And ultimately, those words on the semantic level will not be able to capture my particular grief, which is beyond any sort of representation because it's so mine, idiosyncratic, we might say. But if I can express that grief to you in measure, in poetic language that brings a kind of musicality to it, the sound of that might express depths of my grief or aspects of my grief that my actual semantic rendering of it will not. So more than once, Tennyson suggests that grief is wild, uncontrollable, and that the words can they can control grief, give it a kind of mathematical regularity, but in controlling grief might be able to express at the same time the wildness of that grief through the musicality of the language. So do pay attention to the poem and its various moments where it addresses what poetry can or cannot do. There's, in other words, a meta level to this poem. It's a poem, but also it's a poem about itself as a poem. And of course, one might argue that this is part of what allows the poet to gain some distance from his sorrow and gain some sense of having control over his sorrow. Again, the poem is embodying in form what it's about in content. If working through grief is partially being able to separate yourself from grief to the point where you can think about it and interpret it and make sense out of it, as opposed to being just consumed by it, where you can only cry or wail. If working through grief requires this cognitive distance or emotional distance, let us say, the poem itself and having this meta level in being about itself, in sort of watching itself as it is being written or as it is expressing itself, then we can see the poem itself embodying this distance that this meta level provides.